In 1958, Jerry Lee Lewis was set to embark on a tour that would make him follow Elvis as the next king of rock and roll. But standing in the way of this dream was a deeply salacious scandal. And throughout his life, a series of tragedies and violent incidents unfolded, with many wondering whether his nickname, The Killer, was metaphorical or literal. Jerry Lee Lewis came from humble beginnings in Faraday, Louisiana, where his father Elmo recognized his musical talents from early on. When Jerry was 7, his father mortgaged their home to get him a piano. When he was 14, he often snuck into a nightclub in Faraday called Haney's Big House, then hid behind the bar. He should not have been there for two reasons. Firstly, he was underage, and secondly, this was during the segregation era in the US when white people were not supposed to mix with black people. It was here where he listened to the likes of B.B. King, Muddy Waters, and Ray Charles. He came from an evangelical background and was kicked out of school when he did a boogie-woogie version of My God Is Real. His father believed in him so much that he got a pickup truck to drive his son and his piano around the South where they could go busking. His mother told her son, "Kill him dead," which is when he picked up the name, The Killer. But that's not the only story of how he earned his nickname. Others believe that he was called The Killer because he once tried to strangle one of his teachers. But with Jerry Lee Lewis, it's very difficult to separate fact from fiction. When Jerry was 21, Elmo sold 33 dozen eggs to finance a trip for his son to travel to Memphis and audition for Sam Phillips at Sun Records. Their biggest act, Elvis Presley, was taking black music to a whole new audience, and Jerry and his father saw a golden opportunity ahead of them. For Elmo and Jerry, selling these 396 eggs proved to be an incredibly worthwhile transaction. Sam Phillips was impressed. Jerry initially worked as a session musician at Sun Records until he recorded hits of his own, including Great Balls of Fire and Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On. He was also part of a supergroup known as the $1 Million Quartet, which featured Jerry, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. In May of 1958, Jerry embarked on a UK tour, but once he touched down on British soil, his life would never be the same again. While disembarking a plane, a reporter from the Daily Mail met him on the tarmac. The reporter noticed a young girl traveling with him, and the reporter asked, "Who are you?" The girl's response was, "I'm Myra, Jerry's wife." The reporter asked her how old she was, and Jerry responded that she was 15. Jerry was 22 years of age at the time, and 15 was below the age of consent in the UK. The next morning, the British public got wind of this controversial relationship, and all hell broke loose. Lewis found himself with a smaller audience, and some audience members only went for the purpose of heckling him. His concerts were scheduled to be performed in theaters all owned by a company called Rank, who canceled these tour dates. While staying in his fashionable hotel in Mayfair, he was asked to choose alternative accommodation. Lewis naively thought that this would go away when he returned to the US. However, it soon unraveled that Lewis was not telling the whole truth. In order to get married, Myra needed to lie about her age. In reality, she was only 13. This was Jerry Lee Lewis's third marriage after having married 2 women in quick succession during his teens and early adult life. Another plot twist was that this was no ordinary teenager Jerry had married. It was his cousin once removed, or the daughter of his cousin. Myra's father and Jerry's first cousin Jay responded to this news by grabbing a gun and heading to Sun Records. According to Myra, "The minute Daddy left the house, my mother called Sam Phillips and said, 'Oh my God, you're not gonna believe what's happened, Sam. Jerry and Myra have gotten married, and Jay has his pistol. He's on his way to Sun Records. You better get Jerry out of there.'" Jay arrived at Sun Records full of rage and with a loaded gun. However, Sam Phillips somehow managed to calm him down and persuade him to support this marriage, or at the very least not kill Jerry. Myra said, "There was just no choice. I mean, killing Jerry was not an option. It was his first thought, but it wasn't an option." Jerry's career would never fully recover from this scandal. In 1964, Jerry released a live album based on a concert in Germany called Live at the Star Club, Hamburg. It's been retrospectively considered one of the greatest live albums of all time, but during its release, it was completely overlooked. The age gap between Jerry and Myra meant that Myra was oblivious to how strange their marriage was. On one occasion, she woke up in the early hours of the morning to find that Jerry was still drinking with his friends downstairs. There was a loud fight, and she called the cops. Once the cops left the house, Jerry knocked her out and threatened to kill her if she did that again. And this behavior was the norm in this relationship. However, the worst thing that happened during the relationship had nothing to do with Jerry. Their second son, Steve Allen, fell into a swimming pool and tragically drowned at the age of 3. In the aftermath of this incident, Jerry said something unforgivable to Myra. He uttered, "God punished you, didn't he, girl? Took your son away from you." In the late 60s, Jerry reinvented himself as a country singer and had reasonable success. In 1973, Jerry Lee Jr., a son from his second marriage, was following in his father's footsteps and playing music. He was also following in his father's footsteps by developing a drug addiction too, and he was in and out of mental hospitals and rehab clinics. And just like his half-brother decades earlier, he was involved in an accident. While Jerry Jr. was driving a Jeep, the vehicle flipped on a bad country road, which broke his neck, and he passed away at 19 years of age. Jerry's violent behavior was not limited to his wife Myra. In the year of 1976, he accidentally shot his bassist while holding a pistol. A month afterward, on one memorable trip to Graceland, Jerry tried to kill Elvis. By this time in the mid-70s, Elvis was seen as the person who brought rock music to the mainstream and paved the way for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the countless other bands that followed afterward. Jerry felt a sense of resentment that he got most of the credit, while his big break was taken away from him. Jerry Lee Lewis said in an interview in 2014, "I had created rock and roll before they ever thought about having rock and roll. When Elvis come out, he was rockabilly. When I came out with a whole lot of shaking going on, that was rock and roll. That's when the name rock and roll was put in front." In November 1976, his jealousy and bitterness towards Elvis Presley came to a violent climax. Jerry traveled to Elvis's home at Graceland and wanted to pay his old pal a visit. It was early in the morning, and Jerry was intoxicated. He arrived at Elvis's home, and he was refused entry by security, who told him that Elvis was still asleep. Later that morning, Jerry flipped over Elvis's Rolls Royce, and the next day he arrived at Elvis's house with a gun. Lewis went up to Elvis's security and said, "Get on the phone. I know you got an intercom system. Call up there and tell Elvis I want to visit with him. Who the hell does he think he is? Tell him the killer's here to see him." Police were called, and it's debated whether this phone call was made by Elvis's security or by Elvis himself. It's also debated whether Jerry wanted to kill him or was desperate to meet with Elvis and relive old memories. Jerry got out of jail on a $250 bail, and Elvis died of a heart attack a year later. It wasn't until the 80s that Jerry's nickname, The Killer, was given a new meaning. Jerry's fourth wife was a woman named Jaren Elizabeth Gunn Pate. However, she quickly realized just how abusive Jerry was, and they separated after 2 weeks. Jerry claimed that he only married her because she was pregnant, and then went on to deny that the kid was his. She then applied for a separate maintenance, which would have allowed her to live separately from Jerry. She also applied for child support and accused Jerry of mistreatment. After years of separation, Jerry finally filed for divorce and also accused Jaren of being cruel to him. Jaren fired back by accusing him of adultery, habitual drunkenness, and the use of drugs. In the month that Jaren was set to appear in court for Jerry not paying financial support, she was spending her time at her friend's house in Collierville, Tennessee. In this home, there was a swimming pool, and Jaren was found dead inside. The coroner noted that this was an accidental drowning. Jaren's child, who was possibly Jerry's too, went to live with her grandmother. Rick Bragg, who wrote a biography on Lewis, said, "The coroner ruled that her death was an accident. Jerry Lee would never accept her child as his, and no one would ever launch any legal proceeding to prove his parentage. Some people of long memory in Memphis still call it a case of abandonment, the one thing they cannot forgive, but friends of Jerry Lee would say that the marriage had existed mostly on paper." While this looks to have been simply a tragedy, it was what happened to Jerry's next wife that aroused suspicion. In 1983, Jerry married his fifth wife, Shawn Stevens, but this did not lead to a happily ever after ending either. 4 weeks into their marriage, their housekeeper, Lottie Jackson, noticed something suspicious. Shawn was not out of bed, and when she tried to wake her up, there was no response. She called an ambulance, and the paramedic noticed that her eyes were dilated, and tragically, she was dead. Jerry had reportedly slept in another room when this all happened. When he came down and found out about his wife, there were 2 scratches on his arms. There were also bruises on Shawn's body. However, the autopsy is believed to have cleared Jerry of any wrongdoing. Rolling Stone magazine had an article titled "The Strange and Mysterious Death of Mrs. Jerry Lee Lewis," and this was written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Richard Ben Kramer. An interesting part of this article is the account of when Jerry Lee Lewis referenced himself as the killer, but in a more sinister way. You could interpret his name as the killer because he killed it on stage, or from the word lady killer, meaning he was very successful with women. But in this article, we see another dimension to the nickname. In this article, it reads, "There was trouble from the start of Shawn's marriage to be the rock and roll legend. You scared of me? He once asked her sister. You should be. Why do you think they call me the killer?" 2 months later, Shawn was dead. When discovering her body, the police report said, "There were no visible causes of death, and because Mr. Lewis's bathrobe contained apparent blood stains, and he had a cut on his wrist." The Rolling Stone article said that this report never made it into the investigative file, never left the sheriff's department until after the grand jury had decided no crime had occurred. With Jerry Lee Lewis, we have an incredibly violent man who called himself the Killer, followed by a mysterious death, but there were no criminal charges or evidence really against him. Jerry again got married to Carrie McGarver in 1984, and this seemed like happily ever after. However, after 21 years, Lewis got yet another divorce, and it's not clear what ended this relationship, but that was the longest until that point. During his later years, Jerry was managed by his daughter Phoebe, who he had with Myra. Phoebe also hired her uncle's wife, Judith Brown, to be her father's housekeeper in 2010. This housekeeper ended up getting together with Jerry, and Judith would become Jerry's 7th and final wife. Jerry then sued his daughter. He claimed that she stole money from him and gave him a heavy cocktail of psychotropic drugs to keep him under control. The legal case was dismissed. Vulture magazine tried to describe the incredibly confusing relationship between Jerry and his final wife, Judith. He was his former sister-in-law, who was also something like a second cousin-in-law, his ex-wife's former sister-in-law, and his ex-brother-in-law's ex-wife. Although Jerry Lee Lewis lived fast, he definitely didn't die young. He passed away in 2022, and he has outlived almost everyone from the early rock and roll period. After his death in 2022, there was a mixed response. Ringo Starr and Elton John gave glowing tributes to his music, whereas Vulture magazine said, "He was the very model of a high-functioning sociopath and somehow defied hard living, drug and alcohol abuse, and serious health problems to make it well into his 9th decade." But we can say that, while he may have not gotten credit for his music and how he pushed it forward, he most definitely got to live a longer life than many of the other stars of his time, which is the most important thing.